Hello, everyone. Adrian Sanabria here again, founder of Security Weekly Labs and host of the Enterprise Security Weekly podcast. Thank you for joining us for another installment of SC Media's In Focus. These interviews feature some of the top thought leaders in the cybersecurity space. This is an opportunity for these experts to share hindsight on recent events and foresight on where you should be focused as a cybersecurity professional today and in the near future. Today, we're discussing findings from the latest FortiGuard Labs Threat Landscape Report. We'll be discussing how quickly attackers were able to weaponize Log4j, new attack vectors, particularly against Linux servers and workloads, ransomware attacks becoming more destructive, and stopping criminals faster through a deeper understanding of attack techniques. Joining me today is Derek Manky, the Chief of Security Insights and Global Threat Alliances at Fortinet's FortiGuard Labs. Derek, it's a pleasure to chat with you again. I should have that title down by now.
All good. Yeah, wearing multiple hats as we all do in the industry, as you know, and that's always great to speak with you, Adrian. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, same here. No, I look forward to these because I learn a ton from them. There's always some interesting insights that I haven't read or seen anywhere else in the industry. So yeah, it's very, very compelling stuff, and today is no difference. So maybe the first one to get out of the way, since everybody's been hearing about it for months, is Log4j. But it's always interesting to kind of zoom out, a couple of weeks or a couple of months after something, a big event like this is hit, and see, what did we miss? What in the big picture is interesting that we might not have seen when we were too close to it, in the trenches, remediating it, all that.
Yeah. Yeah, the ripple effect, collateral damage, and also the president, I think that said as well too. So if we look at our telemetry data, global telemetry data from FortiGuard Labs, we literally saw an explosion, and that I think most people are aware of this, right? They knew it was big, they knew there was a surge of activity, but when we really look at the data and start comparing it and looking at other campaigns in the past, it was interesting, right, to look at how quickly this took off. And it's sort of in line, I think we covered our predictions piece as to what's going to be coming ahead in 2022, and this is already ringing true. We called it a feeding frenzy. So the idea of attackers capitalizing on fresh vulnerabilities in a shorter window, like that attack cycle is shrinking, how quickly they can get the vulnerability, weaponize it, exploit it, and start doing attack campaigns. And we saw that if we looked at proxy logon as an example, this was a group of vulnerabilities. As these usually unfold, it's not just one CVE usually or one vulnerability. When there's a lot of eyes on something like this, multiple ones are discovered, and that rang true with proxy logon last year. That also happened with Log4j. And if we take those group of vulnerabilities between the two, and we highlighted this in the report, it was night and day. It was 50 times increase in terms of what we're calling a rate of exploit. So a 10-day window that we looked at just how quickly that spread, just like a wildfire would, right, in real life. And it literally was just that. It's 50 times faster than proxy logon, which was already a big campaign, as we know, from last year.
Well, and I think something that was interesting about Log4j is that you could indirectly attack it. As long as your exploit string made it into a log somewhere, you didn't need a port exposed to the internet necessarily. Like one example I saw somebody show, I don't know if this was an actual exploited vector, but like, when I get a notification, when I get an SMS message that a prescription is ready, it's a piece of software that sends that out. So replying to that with the exploit string, I think in one case, somebody like changing the name of your iPhone, got you a shell in iCloud at one point before Apple fixed things really quickly.
Yeah.
So this idea that you can just kind of shotgun blast the exploit string in different places and just wait for shells to come back was concerning,
to say the least. Yeah. And it really emphasizes the underlying problem. We talk about connected attack surface a lot. This is I wouldn't say great because it's not good in the long run, but it's a prime example of that, right? Of more stacks integrating certain library code as an example. And as soon as you have a vulnerability with that, it literally has that capability to shotgun, like you said. Another example, this is going years back, but shell shock was one, I think 10 years ago, where you had a lot of, the best shell integration as an example too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just to give a bit of context here, I think I remember seeing a report a couple of years back saying Log4j is so popular, it's used in like a third of all Java projects and applications.
Yeah, and I think that this, again, it sets a precedent. I don't think this is a rogue wave, right? Yes, it's a big one, of course, what we saw happen, but the fact is, there's more, unfortunately, there's going to be more of these type of Log4js in the future, right? Not Log4j specifically, but similar things. It's just a matter of time, obviously, because there's a lot of fresh eyes looking at this in the wake of what was a successful attack campaigns, right? That piggybacked on this.
And I remember seeing in real time, I was on Twitter all that weekend when it was announced from Friday on through, and people are trying to block it with their WAFs. And those WAF evasions were, they were popping up minutes, hours after people were trying to block this stuff. Super fast.
Yeah, and I think we've talked about this before also, that when we look at threat intelligence and how we're looking at the actual techniques that attackers are executing, defense evasion has always been, but we're seeing this as one of the highest methods of focus, if you will, that attackers are focusing in their malware and their attack campaigns. And yeah, exactly, with the obfuscation that we saw in strings, it's just one example of that, right? There's a lot of different ways already that came quicker, again, with that speed of theme.
Yeah. And so moving on here, to some new things that we're starting to see, maybe not entirely new, but certainly trends that, again, I've not really seen much reporting on. And I guess there's been a low boil here where we've seen attacks against Linux. I think it was a big shift when Mirai popped up in 2016. Like I remember, not only is this an ELF binary, but it's cross-compiled for a dozen different CPUs. Like that's crazy. But of course, they're going after IoT devices. And it sounds like we're seeing more attacks against more mainstream Linux server, virtual Linux workloads. Maybe even as usual, two sides of the coin here, right? We have obviously the service stack, and you look for the Log4j and implementations, but then we have the payload itself. And yeah, we saw, if we looked at Q1 from 2021 to Q4 as an example, there was it quadrupled in terms of the amount of, so there's a ramp up definitely even at the end of Q4. And if we look at the whole year over year from for 2021, there was a 200% increase, or doubled effectively, in terms of the amount of binaries. And we're not talking about, yes, we're seeing more Mariah. Of course, Mariah is still a clear and present danger in terms of threats, but we're seeing many more families now, right? Mushtik was one example, and Red XOR too. Like there's a whole growing list. Crypto miners, of course, and included in there too, but there's a variety, more diversity happening. And case in point, more support from a attacker's perspective being done for ELF binaries. And you're right, it has been a low boil, but now it's interesting, especially last year and in the second half, we're seeing much more, as I said, many more families and diversity there. Yeah, and maybe also a shift in some of the goals here. What is this malware focused on? What are the kind of payloads? Is this like more modular malware, like a trick bot or something like that? What's the functionality you're seeing with these Linux malwares?
Yeah, definitely more modular. That's a growing theme that we see. So multi-purpose, especially on the botnet side. So crypto miners, of course, I think that's always going to be there. It's just, that's a matter of how we can capitalize more on CPU resources, of course. So that is a category of itself. But we're also seeing more info stealers too, being put in there too. Redline stealer is one example of that. Also, we had talked about the credential harvesters too, right? So that's another piece there, and specifically with crypto wallets. We even saw Linux binaries specifically targeting credentials for crypto credentials, right? So that's another theme there too.
Mm-hmm. And calling them info stealers, that's a good lead into the next topic here, because when you say ransomware to most people, they think crypto ransomware. They think ransomware with a payload that encrypts your files so that you have to pay for a key to decrypt your files again. But, exfiltrating data is another way to, another lever to get you to pay a ransom, threatening to delete files, DDoS attack even, what I guess we need to kind of rethink what ransomware is, and what those different payloads are as they diversify into different techniques.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a big discussion, I think, right? So yeah, the data cryptors, that was, that's so 2010. I remember doing my first presentation at a security conference in Toronto, and it was all your
Does it go
data
back that far?
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
wow.
It was my presentation was called "All Your Data Are Belong to Us." Playing on that.
That was the meme back then. That was very cool. Just so everyone knows that.
Back
that
then,
was very cool back then.
So, but that's when actually that was the rise of the, let's say, commercialization of ransomware. That's when they started figuring out to do asymmetric encryption, to do key management per victim. That was a big thing, because up until then it was relatively easy for the industry to create decryptors, as an example, once you had just one specific key. So that was sort of the rise of ransomware. It shifted from scareware to ransomware. There's a lot of that rogue AV software, and then ransomware became the flavor. And that's where ransomware really took its name from, right? Because it was the ware part, it's malware, right? That was specifically designed to encrypt data for ransom. Yeah, like you said, now it's not about payload so much anymore. Yes, we have ransomware, which is payload that runs on a system, whether it's Linux or Windows or whatever, what have you. Yes, we still do see data cryptors, but not so much anymore, right? It's much more on the info stealer angle, as an example, data exfiltration, holding the data itself in extortion threats, right? As an example, or DDoS. That's another part of ransomware. So a lot of it's botnet focused, right? Because if you look at what it's doing, it's downloading different payloads to try to do, myriad different activities, including information stealing, including DDoS to take down services, because if a service is down, really that's probably bleeding more money than a couple of document files sitting on a system that's probably in a backup anyway nowadays. And wiper malware is another, we talk about killware now, which is another ware theme, but it's, destructive ransomware. And again, it's just another tool that they have in their playbook. That's really what this is about. It's more of a ransom playbook, tactics we talk about, versus just a, dinosaur sort of, data cryptor of ransomware.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's key, that it sounds like you're saying we in how many of these do you see multiple techniques used? Do you see both cryptors and info stealers, or DDoS and an info stealers? Is that pretty typical to see multiple employed in the same campaign?
Yeah, I would say we haven't seen too much convergence on a technique level yet, but that's interesting. I think that will start. It's going to be more. It's been more a la carte so far. So they have these capabilities. It really depends on the target they're hitting, right? And what is going to yield the largest result. Again, if they have if it's an OT network and they know there's or a manufacturing plant, and they can take a certain line down for 5 hours, and that's going to translate to X amount of dollars, and then that's going to be their preferred tactic. But in reality, what happens is, because they're doing a lot more of the reconnaissance, they're understanding the targets more, they're crafting this to be able to, to take let's call it the most effective path, right? But with that said, so we're seeing more convergence and development on that playbook. So usually just one campaign that they're launching. So, DDoS is an example, or information stealing for extortion, not so much on the data crypting side, but we're seeing more development on the tactics. We talked about this before. I think service departments effectively they're creating, and it's really about this enterprise model. And that's where we're seeing a lot more of these different techniques come together, from the operators. And of course, there's the whole RAAS, the ransom as a service business model there too.
Yeah. And I think in every one of these, there's been some kind of nod to, the fact that on the criminal side, it's starting to mirror the same business practices. I think I've seen that they hire actual pen testers. Maybe some of these pen testers don't know that they're participating in a criminal attack. Maybe they just they're happy to look the other way. But
Yeah.
But yeah, with the marketplaces, for all these, for the malware, for the techniques and everything, it's and they've got the money. Well, like for the first time, we've got a pretty good view of how much money they're stealing, right?
Yeah. And yeah, this is exactly why I'm referring to this as advanced persistent cybercrime now, because again, with the money comes the sophistication from a threat perspective, because we're becoming more well-funded to, again, weaponize and spend more time on the reconnaissance, on the targeted attacks, on the 0 days as an example, not on the data cryptors, which is just cast a really wide fishing net, but again, understanding their targets and understanding where they can hit them the hardest and extort them most money, exfiltrate data, so forth. And that's the sort of new normal with this, right? We're seeing more and more of that. Again, with the botnets, they're becoming more sophisticated to be able to use with those ransom tactics. They're multi-purpose tools now, instead of just a monolithic, like a DDoS botnet as an example. And so, yeah, I think, unfortunately, it's been a result of profiting over the years, and we're seeing that now.
And reinvesting profits. Very businesslike, yeah. Yeah. So before we wrap here, I want to take a look at one of my favorite projects that you guys are working on, which is really tracking a lot of the TTPs being used by some of these different malwares and criminal groups, and almost prioritizing them, zooming in on which ones are most often used, which I think can help defenders a lot in prioritizing how they defend, where they choose to defend.
Yes. Yeah. So this is about visibility, of course, prioritization, pinpointing those pain points, right? I mean, like the targets on a technique level. So refer to this as high resolution threat intelligence, because it's not just here's a whole bunch of logs, here's a whole bunch of problems. It's really pinpointing it and categorizing these problems. So, and that's using MITRE ATT&CK framework. We're actually a research sponsor working very closely with MITRE and the Center for Threat Informed Defense. It's in the name, that threat informed defense. It's the same idea, being able to understand the threats, categorize and prioritize them. And if you look at the MITRE ATT&CK framework, it's good, but it's massive, right? There's many different columns. There's over 200 different techniques, and it's a framework. But if you take that framework and you look at, okay, what matters to a specific organization, where are those threats highlighted within that framework? What's the prevalence of those? How do you prioritize that? That's exactly what we're doing in the report. So we actually categorize that through the second half of 2021. And we're showing things like execution category, which is the tactic, as an example. And so if we looked at, there's, let's say, many different ways to execute threats, but really what are the top 3 or 4 that you should be concerned about? That's what we're doing. And it's new, it's a work in progress, but it's really fascinating, right? And we're clearly seeing, we highlight in the report, that a majority, so that within the top 3 techniques for execution, it was executing through APIs, followed by user execution, and then scripting. So just execution through API and scripting was over 60% of all the activity. And that points to automation, and that points to that speed theme that we're talking about, versus I believe it's 20-something% on the user execution, waiting for a user to interact first to further the threat. So it's interesting, right? We're clearly seeing a shift, I would say, in tactics more and more towards that automation theme, and moving the threats quicker through that kill chain.
Yeah. And even though we talked about the increase in interest in Linux, I'm looking at that persistence column, and I see words like registry and scheduled task in there. Reminds me of how much Windows is still very much the main target.
Yeah, absolutely. We shouldn't lose sight of that. And again, those are yeah, it's just still techniques that they're using to stay alive on systems. And again, persistence is going back to that keyword I said, advanced persistent cybercrime. Stop focus on persistence again, right? Because they really are trying to remain persistent on these networks. And part of that is also the defense evasion too. Unfortunately, it's that game of chess, and they're always looking at ways that they can try to get around security controls. And that's exactly why this is important, right? Because we can identify the ways they're trying to do that and make sure that we have the relevant solutions in place.
All right. Well, as always, thank you for the sneak preview in the report here. I look forward to reading the full report when it comes out. And with that, we've been talking to Derek Manky with Fortinet's FortiGuard Labs. Derek, thank you for being in focus with us today.
It's a pleasure. Thanks, Adrian.